Okay, so this is our fourth session, as I said, and it is the second of two sessions we're doing on the article, What is Capitalism by Ayn Rand. We started in on that article last week, on Tuesday, and we talked about the first half, or a little bit more than half of the article, where Rand is laying the moral foundations for capitalism. She talks about the fact that previous discussions of capitalism and of within the field of political economy more generally have been on what she calls the tribal premise. They've been trying to discuss society without properly considering man's nature and without really rethinking ethics in a way that she thinks is necessary to understand capitalism. So what she does is she starts by looking at the nature of a human being. She starts with the idea that man is a rational animal and reason requires freedom to function. This brings her to the idea of individual rights. And then she defines capitalism as the system recognizes individual rights, including property rights in which all property is privately owned. She then comes at what capitalism is in a somewhat different way and what its justification is in a somewhat different way. She says that all social systems are based on and justified on some kind of ethics. There's a common kind of ethical belief, which she calls the tribal perspective or tribal premise, behind previously existing social systems, and attempts have been made to explain and defend capitalism in terms of it, which she thinks doesn't work. And in place of that, she thinks we need to look at it a very different way. And to do that, she talks about different theories of the good. She distinguishes between the objective, the intrinsic, and the subjective theory of the good. We talked about that last time. And says that capitalism is the only social system that's based implicitly on an objective theory of values. And that is what we're going to talk about today, this idea of capitalism as a system based on an objective theory of values. And particularly, we're going to talk about how that how this objective view of values is embodied in a market economy. And I'm going to turn it over to Ankar, who will lead us off on that.
Thanks, Greg, and hello, everyone. So I want to read the passage where she makes the transition to now looking specifically at a market in terms of the distinction she's made between an intrinsic, subjective, and objective view or approach to values. And this is what she writes. So I quote, "It is in regard to a free market that the distinction between an intrinsic, subjective, and objective view of values is particularly important to understand. The market value of a product is not, italicized not, is not an intrinsic value, not a, in quotes, value in itself, hanging in a vacuum. A free market never loses sight of the question of value to whom. And within the broad field of objectivity, the market value of a product does not reflect its philosophically objective value, that's italicized, but only its socially objective value." Close quote. And she goes on then to talk, so this is a distinction that she's originating between a philosophically objective value, socially objective value. She goes on for about a page to talk about that. And then it's, quoting again, "This does not mean, however, that the values ruling a free market are subjective, italicized, close quote." And then she goes on to talk about that. So I think part of what she's arguing here, and part how to read this essay, is that people look at the operations of the market from the lens, and often unknowingly, they're not conscious of doing this, but this is what they're doing. They look at the operations of the market from an intrinsic theory of value or a subjective theory of value. And they're going to have all kinds of confusions, puzzles, and objections to the operations of a free market. And they're going to think, you can put it very broadly, that what's happening on the market is unfair or unjust. It's morally, there's something problematic about what's happening on the market and the outcomes of a market if they're operating with these wrong approaches to value. You have to have a right approach and then make some distinctions about the thinking about the objectivity of value, and particularly this distinction between philosophically objective and socially objective that she then goes on in the essay to talk about if you're to really understand the operations of a free market. And I think it's useful at the outset in thinking about this distinction to think of some of the concrete examples and contrasts that she gives, and then to think about objections to the market and to the outcomes of a market that you may have heard from this perspective. So she contrasts the value of an airplane and the invention of the airplane with a bicycle and the invention of a bicycle. And it's that an airplane is of a philosophically higher value than a bicycle. She contrasts the works of Victor Hugo to true confession magazines, and that there's a perspective of what, and again, if one's thinking, as she thinks, formulates it, of the philosophically objective value, that Victor Hugo's works are of greater value than true confession magazines. She contrasts microscope and lipstick, and then the manufacturer of microscopes and the manufacturer of lipsticks. And again, she thinks there's some perspective from which you can say the microscope is the greater product, the greater invention. It's of a higher value. And she contrasts Einstein and Einstein's achievements with those of Elvis Presley. And for all of these, and again, it's that Einstein is the greater achievement, that from some perspective, it's right to say his is the greater achievement than what Presley has done in his career. And there's perspectives and critiques of the market from both directions in that it's unfair to the exceptional men. So why doesn't Einstein earn as much as Elvis Presley does on the market? There's something morally wrong, unjust, unfair about this. Einstein's is the greater achievement, yet Elvis Presley is the greater monetary reward. There's something wrong with that. Similarly, this is the kind of thing that she's bringing up about microscope and lipstick. It's the manufacturer of lipsticks might make a greater fortune than the manufacturer of microscopes, and yet from some perspective, microscopes are more valuable than lipstick. So isn't something going wrong in terms of thinking about the justice of a market? But from the other direction too, it's that there's the idea that the average man is exploited by the exceptional person in a capitalist system. It's the industrialist and the tycoon is the person who makes the fortunes, and the worker, the laborer, they don't, and yet aren't they really the source of value and production? And that's the more, you can think of it as the more Marxist kind of view, the whole labor productivity of value. It comes from the laborer, the worker, his muscular physical effort. That's the source of value. And yet you see these rich capitalists who have the fortunes, and then are often painted as sort of they're like a Scrooge who just sits on piles of money. They don't do anything, and then somehow the money just keeps flowing in. So you get, and you can think of it maybe as sort of the Marxist, it's labor's the root of value, and it's somehow exploited. If you think of another person who I think Ayn Rand would put in the collectivist camp, Plato, we need a rule of philosopher kings. We need the rule of these exceptional people who are otherwise would be exploited. A system of that would be freer and so is somehow detrimental to them. I think there's an element of thinking about the character of Robert Stadler in Atlas Shrugged, as there's something like I'm the Einstein and Elvis Presley makes so much money And how can this be? And shouldn't some of this money be going to me? And I'm fine if the government takes it from Elvis and gives it to me. There's an element of that going on. I think there's deeper issues going on than that. So I think she thinks of these, and I think rightly, that these are common critiques of the workings of a free market or a capitalist system. That either the exceptional men are exploiting the average, or the average is somehow exploiting the exceptional. And she's stressing, and this comes out after this discussion, and the distinction she's making, that the progress in capitalism, the way to think of it, is individualistic and non-sacrificial. And I think part of the meaning there of non-sacrificial is it's neither right to think that the exceptional men exploit the average men, or that the average men are exploiting the exceptional men. They're rising, and they're rising together individually, each according to their ability and the choices that they make, and the sort of the choice to think and to produce to the extent of their ability. And to really understand that, I think she thinks you need this distinction between socially objective and philosophically objective value. That even though there's a perspective from which, and now let's put it the way that she describes the perspective of when you're looking at things from their thinking about them, as she puts it, the philosophically objective value. This is how she writes and how she characterizes it. Quote, by philosophically objective, I mean a value estimated from the standpoint of the best possible to man, i.e., by the criterion of the most rational mind possessing the greatest knowledge in a given category, in a given period, and in a defined context. In brackets, nothing can be estimated in an undefined context. And then you get some examples of which I mentioned. So still continuing the quote. For instance, it can be rationally proved that the airplane is objectively of immeasurably greater value to man, in parentheses, to man at his best, close parentheses, than the bicycle, and that the works of Victor Hugo are objectively of immeasurably greater value than true confession magazines. And then continuing. But if a given man's intellectual potential can barely manage to enjoy true confession magazines, there is no reason why his meager earnings, the product of his effort, should be spent on books he cannot read, or on subsidizing the airplane industry if his own transportation needs do not extend beyond the range of a bicycle. Nor is there any reason, this is in parentheses, nor is there any reason why the rest of mankind should be held down to the level of his literary taste, his engineering capacity, and his income. Values are not determined by fiat nor by majority vote, close quote. And so I think part of the perspective to get is what happens in a market is neither the person of a more limited range of ability, of knowledge, of productivity, he's not sacrificed to the person who's able to conceive and invent and engineer an airplane, this new discovery that revolutionizes transportation and makes possible all kinds of new industries and trades. You don't sacrifice him to those people, but nor are those people held down by this. They're not serving this person. They're not held down to his level of knowledge, his level of ability. They're free and they go on to invent airplanes and automobiles and so on. So there's not sacrifice in either direction. If you understand that the value, that the way to think of value, as she had put it earlier when she's describing the objective perspective, can never lose never lose the perspective of values mean of value to whom and for what. And you have to think of the individuals involved who are pursuing their interest in lives according to their values and their level of knowledge and ability and intelligence. That's what it looks like when you're talking about someone pursuing values. And the free market never abstracts away from that, or treats it, the individual pursuits, as unimportant, or as non-existent, even, I think, in the end. So there's but there nevertheless is a perspective which you can look at things, as she says, from the best possible within man. If you're talking about a certain level and level of knowledge that we've reached at a certain point in development and civilization, that's relevant to thinking about the issue of values, but so is the issue of their values to a specific person in a specific context, given his life, knowledge, abilities, and values. And when you're thinking about the trade that goes on, that determines the prices in a free market and the valuations in a free market, it's individuals who are trading, pursuing their interests, pursuing their happiness, who are the agents involved in all these things. And she said, so from that perspective, when we're thinking about the value set on a free market, you have to think of it as that's what's happening. And she calls that's the socially objective value. Now, she thinks there's a relationship between these two, but these are two different perspectives that she thinks are important. They're really important, but you have to be able to distinguish these two and relate them. And the intrinsic and subjective views on values aren't able to do this. So and you can think of it a little bit like the intrinsic one thinks too much just of the philosophically objective value. Like Einstein, this is such a great achievement, which it is. I mean, it's this huge scientific achievement, but then it's, well, so shouldn't he be a millionaire? And why is Elvis Presley a millionaire? And that's all, they drop all kinds of a context. And the other perspective is just, as she put from what I quoted, well, it's just determined by fiat. It's what people happen to desire, happen to want. And she doesn't think that either. But in able to think, I think, clearly about this distinction she's arguing is crucial. So we can go now into more detail or some application of that. But I think that's a bit about the distinction and why she's making the distinction, and why she thinks it's important to make this distinction when looking at the functioning of capitalism. So Greg, you want to come in here?
Well, we had a couple of questions about the distinction and the need for it in the Facebook group over the course of the last few days. I think Augustina has them flagged. Maybe it would be good to just hear from the people who said that, just get the quotes from them, and we can react to that.
Yes, Steve had a question related to moral value and market value, and if I want to see if Steve is here in the session so he can maybe ask his question.
It doesn't look like
it.
They're alphabetized by first name, it looks like, and he's not there. But maybe you can just read it out for us or summarize.
I'll just read it. He asks, why not just say you have moral value on the one hand and market value on the other? That's one of his questions.
Yeah, so how is the philosophically objective value different from market value, and how is the philosophically objective value different from the moral value of something, and how is the socially objective value different from the market value of it?
Exactly. And he adds, isn't the philosophically objective value a sort of hypothetical rationalistic construct?
Mm-hmm. So Ankhar, do you want to speak to this? Or?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about it. I think philosophically objective, it's important that one not think about it as moral value. I think it's from the perspective of the value of production. So in that sense, it's partly a moral perspective, but it's not just a moral evaluation. So it's not a moral evaluation that Einstein is morally superior to Elvis, or the manufacturers of microscopes are morally superior to the manufacturers of lipsticks. I don't think that is the distinction being made at all. So it's from the perspective of production, the value of production, the advancement of human life, and from a long range perspective as well. I think that's part of when we're taking a philosophical perspective, we're thinking long range. And if you think then of the inventor of the microscope, his contribution to the advancement of human knowledge, of science, of technology, the microscope is part of what opens up that there's a whole level below what we just perceive. So we knew there's things around us that are sort of at our scale, and there's things up in the sky, the sun, the moon, that are of a much bigger scale. But to get to that, there's this whole realm of the sub-perceptual, the microscopic. The microscope is part of what opens up this whole field of knowledge, of science, of technology. So it's an enormous advance in that regard, in the way that lipstick is not. And I think the same airplane, bicycle. One of the ways to think of it is you can talk about the age of the airplane, that it makes possible all kinds of interconnection of people who are engaged in production and trade. I mean, you can get across the globe in a day or less than when it took months before. And just all kinds of production and trade is possible because you can do that. That wasn't possible before. And the bicycle, though it's a real advance in transportation. So no one speaks of the age of the bicycle because it doesn't have that impact on production and human advancement. And that's the perspective. And so it's important when she says it's partly moral, because she says the most rational person, and whether you're rational or irrational, is chosen, on her perspective, it's chosen. And that's a moral issue because you have direct control over that. But of the greatest level of knowledge and so on, that's not a moral issue, that Newton or Einstein has much more knowledge than I have or is more intelligent, is a more powerful thinker. That's not a moral failing on my part. So I think it's important that she's deliberately not formulating it as though it's an issue of moral value.
Okay, and then what about is the socially objective value the same as the market value? Here I think it's closer than in the other case is the philosophically objective value the same as the moral value? I would say the philosophically objective value is the market value, but there's a reason for this extra locution, because we're trying to establish that the market value is objective as opposed to being intrinsic or subjective. So there's and there's a meaning to objective, right? It means an evaluation by a human mind based on facts, right? So it's when we say that it's a thing to say, it's a point to make, that the market value is socially objective, that the market value is objective in a way, and then this concept of socially objective captures the respect in which it is objective. In what respect is it objective? Well, it is capturing the judgments made by all the different people who are market participants, which judgments have to be made by them individually by using their own mind. And of course, they won't all be functioning rationally in doing this. Some of them will and some of them won't be. But this is the rational way to organize a society so as to enable people who are rational to judge rationally and act on their judgments, and enable those judgments to sum up into a number, into a total that reflects the value. And then there are causes why over time, and then having a market structure will punish people for their irrationality or their mistakes, and reward them for their rationality and achievement. And so in this way, over time, the value will tend to correct and become more and more accurate to what it would be if everybody were being rational, because your market power is in effect enhanced by where you succeed due to your rationality. So again, it's a process on a societal scale that is the equivalent on a societal scale of the process of objective judgment on an individual scale. Even though not everybody participating will be being objective, many of the people will be, and it will encourage and reward those who are being, so that they will have more influence and power over it going forward. So again, if you take the idea of objectivity, this is what objectivity amounts to in valuing on a social scale, when you have people interacting to determine the value. And so in that sense, the value on a market is objective. And then we have a name for the type of objectivity involved here, and that's socially objective.
I have a question from Jonathan from Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
He says, and I quote, Harry Binswanger, I believe, in his lectures on economics, has said, in effect, that socially objective prices are objective because the market itself is self-regulating, and thus people can't be rational forever. And he clarifies that it's his own summary, not Harry Binswanger's. And he's asking for comment on that.
I didn't understand the last part. People can be rational forever?
It says prices are objective because the market itself is self-regulating, and thus people can't be irrational forever.
Oh, can't be irrational forever.
Exactly.
Okay, so that makes a lot more sense. Yeah, so I think that I've talked to Harry about this. I don't remember that particular lecture, although I think I was there. But I think the point that Jonathan is alluding to from Harry is more or less the point that I was making, that as an individual in being objective has to go through a process, and it's a process that is rational on the individual level and self-correcting. So too, the process of a market by which a group of people collaboratively determines the value of something is the rational process for them to go through, and is self-correcting in nature. And so that's a parallel between the process of a market and the process of individual reasoning and evaluation. The process of individual reasoning and evaluation is crucial to an individual's values being objective. And this market process is crucial to, or what enables, a society's valuation to be objective. And I think we can contrast it to other ways in which a society might get together to try to value something, right? To try to evaluate something. So we could all vote on the one man, one vote premise about which things are most valuable. We could get a commissar to set the prices of everything, and then we could democratically elect the commissars. And so here we're going through, or we could just do it by direct referenda or something. And so here we're going through a social process of, as a group, deciding what value bread has to all of us as a group, right? But this isn't an objective, rational way to do it. It's one that's going to lead to either oversupply and rotting, or shortages, as it does when people try to fix or control prices. And of course, we do this all the time, right? So the minimum wage is a social attempt to value labor. Price controls is a social attempt to evaluate what the prices of various things should be. Tariffs and subsidies are social attempts by the people as a whole, by the government, to set the value of things. So these are social valuings of things, as opposed to an individual's valuing them. But they're non-objective social ways of valuing them. They're ways that are subjective, that privilege whatever the group feels like, that aren't kind of self-correcting and empowering of the most rational actors over time, and that divorce the valuer from the valuing. So they treat the valuer as though it's the society as a whole. And then we all sum up to vote for what the society as a whole should value it. Whereas valuers are never really societies as a whole, so they're individuals within it. And only the market process enables us to work out a rational way to value the thing that's based upon the valuations of it by all the individuals within the market. And so that, therefore, again, this is why it's the objective way of valuing something in a social context, as opposed to a subjective way. But Ankar, do you want to say anything more on this?
Yeah, one more thing. I also don't remember the full context of what was quoted from one of Harry Binswanger's lectures. But I don't know if this was said in that lecture or not, but I think the self-correcting element of it is important. That's important to objectivity as a whole, the whole phenomenon of objectivity. But it self-corrects if a person's rational. And it's similar in regard to thinking then of the operations of a market, that what the market does is it encourages rationality. It encourages that one learn from one's mistake. And that's part of what she's emphasizing, because you bear the consequences of your mistakes. But nothing can guarantee the rationality. And so nothing can guarantee that a person will actually self-correct. And if you look how she formulates it, it's very interesting. So this is, she spends time explaining this in the connection of the issue of microscopes and lipstick, and that there's a perspective from which you can say the microscope is the greater value and it's the greater achievement and so on. But this is what she writes then. So again, quoting, "This does not mean, however, that the values ruling a free market are subjective. If the stenographer spends all her money on cosmetics and has none left to pay for the use of a microscope, in brackets for a visit to the doctor, when she needs it," italicized, "she learns a better method of budgeting her income. The free market serves as her teacher. She has no way to penalize others for her mistakes. If she budgets rationally," but it's if she budgets rationally, "the microscope is always available to serve her own specific needs and no more." Again, italicized, "and no more. As far as she is concerned, she is not taxed to support an entire hospital, a research laboratory, or a spaceship's journey to the moon. Within her own productive power, she does pay a part of the cost of scientific achievements when and as she needs them." Again, italicized. "She has no social duty," in quotes. "Her own life is her only responsibility, and the only thing that a capitalist system requires of her is the thing that nature," italicized, "requires, rationality, i.e. that she live and act to the best of her own judgment." Close quote. And there too, you can see the emphasis on she's not sacrificed to anybody, but nor are they sacrificed to her level of knowledge or her errors, if she makes errors in regard to this. And then the more putting it in terms of a principle, but notice how it's worded. Now I'm skipping a little bit. "The philosophically objective value of a new product serves as the teacher for those who are willing to exercise their rational faculty, each to the extent of his ability." Close quote. And that's the sense in which you can call it self-correcting, but it's not, it doesn't, if you think of that as and you omit the whole phenomenon of volition, you're not getting what objectivity means, either on a market or more broadly, her notion of objectivity, because it's crucial that it's volitional adherence to the facts. And a person can disregard the facts.
So what about the issue? I think this is, I'm guessing or sensing from things Harry said in other contexts, is part of the point that Harry was making. So suppose the person decides to continue being irrational. Well, then the market's not going to teach her if she refuses to learn from it. But she will have less influence on the market than she would have if she were being more rational, because she'll, as a result of this, get poorer and poorer, and so have less money to spend, and money that she might have had will be in the hands of other people who will, on balance, be more rational than her. So it's not going to make the individual more rational if they refuse to think, but it will give opportunities to the thinkers, and the non-thinkers will miss out on the opportunities and therefore have less economic power.
Yeah, I think that isn't, but I wouldn't put it exactly like that. And I have heard it sometimes be put by some objectivists like that, in the sense that it's not, well, the money goes somewhere else, or it's that she's less productive than otherwise she could have been. She's less able to achieve her values. In this case, she might get sick and miss work, or I mean, even die in this kind of case. But it's just, she's less productive, but she's not an obstacle to other people being productive, and they can go on without her. And in that sense, they can gain more and more economic power, and she's not gaining it. So relatively speaking, she's less consequential in the market.
So it's not that the power is shunted away from her to them. It's that the power is wealth and productive ability. Other people are producing more of it, and she's not.
Yeah, right.
Good. We have a question from Megan. This is, I think, really reacting to something you said earlier, Ankar, when you were talking about the difference between moral value and philosophically objective value. You said the relevant fact isn't that it's moral of the guy to have invented the microscope, although it is moral of him, but that's just part of what goes into the philosophically objective value. She asks, is there a moral evaluation to be made of the person who produces math as opposed to the person who produces the microscope? So she's, I'm guessing, a Breaking Bad fan. I think yes. I mean, if meth is bad, and if a life of producing meth and being a meth salesperson is not a life of creating values, and we can talk about what makes a job worth having and a life worth living. But if that is a bad thing, and you know, from what I know about it, I think it is. And producing producing Microsoft or a microscope is a good thing, then yeah, I think there's a moral evaluation of someone who chooses to go into a career that's to selling poison, basically, rather than helping people live to the best of their ability. But I don't think that's as directly relevant to the economics point and to the objectivity of the market point. Ankar, any thoughts on that?
Yeah,
I think you want to come back in on this.
I think these are interesting kinds of cases to think about. To take another, because I think she deliberately gives both more at the material level and more at the intellectual level. And if you think of some of the examples, Einstein, Elvis is in the arts, Victor Hugo in the True Confession magazines, and then you can think of some airplane, bicycle as the more physical, or stressing the creation of material values and the material aspect and the technology aspect. I think it's deliberate. She doesn't contrast Victor Hugo's works to modern art. And if you read the Romantic Manifesto, she thinks modern art is not art. It's an attack on art. It's an attack on values, not the creation of a value just of a lesser value, but still a value. So it's not a creation of something, well, it's not as good as Victor Hugo's works, but it's still, there's a context in which you can understand why people value it. And so she thinks a modern art it's not a real value. And so I think the whole context here is people creating values, but you have to think about what that means and a value to whom and for what. But there is such a thing as the creation of things that are not values. And you have to have a different perspective on that, of what is going on. And I think morally as well, there's a different, of someone who's dedicating their life to the destruction of values.
But then, of course, we want to think about values to whom and for what. So there is a market for math. There is a market for modern art. It goes for a lot more money, in fact, than some art we might think is better or is real art when it isn't. So how would you apply the philosophically objective versus socially objective value point to the kinds of things that we would say are not just lesser values philosophically, but are not values at all philosophically?
I think it's similar in the sense that it's people's existing evaluations, but those evaluations can be really wrong. So they can be wrong if you take the example of the stenographer, is that she gives too much importance to the lipstick and that whole aspect, and not enough at all to the scientific achievements, and she doesn't budget at all, that she can't even go to the doctor when she needs it. So that's an error of one scale. And there's things that push in the direction of, you're making an error here, you should budget differently, and she can correct or not. But there's wider errors that you can make that are, again, you can think of them as self-correcting, but it's harder for self-correcting and what it would mean for the market and the culture to be pushing in the direction of look, this is a mistake and so on, it's a much wider context. And I think she would think I think for sure there's people she thinks who have been taken in by the whole modern art phenomenon. This isn't really art, but for some of it, you could think of it as like wall decoration. It's like an interesting pattern or something like that. And there's errors, and they haven't learned to appreciate great art and so on. And I think she thinks in a free market, there's a push towards, look, you're missing out on something. But what it takes to learn that and to understand that, and that I've been taken in by modern art, and that there's something much greater than that, you need a lot of knowledge to get to that perspective, and it's a much longer period. So I think there's similar things to say, but the range of examples that she's giving, I think, is important in thinking about the whole phenomenon.
It is significant in the art case in particular that she thinks art reached its highest flourishing in the 19th century, which was certainly the freest century up till that point, and in some respects freer than we've been since, in other respects less free. The freedom has been extended to more people since, but has been less complete in its extension to them. But I don't think she thought that was a coincidence.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have any more questions about this idea of philosophically objective value versus socially objective value, and the respects in which the capitalism is based on the objectivity of value? I think there was one or two things that came up, more people asking about this on the Facebook group over the course of the week. So Augustine, if you can find anything from there you think worth raising, do so. Also, anyone now who has a question specifically on that topic before we move on, now would be a great time for us to take that. I'll just take a few seconds to see if questions populate into the question feed or hands shoot up in our hand list.
And I just say, for people interested in this distinction, I mean, the other places that it's discussed in Dr. Peikoff's The Objectivism and the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, the chapter on capitalism, I believe, and it's discussed in I've got the companion here that Greg edited along with Alan Gotthelf, and I discuss it for a few pages, this distinction in, I think it's a free mind and a free market.
Yeah, I find Ankar's discussion of it especially clarifying. So I particularly recommend people go to that. It's just he elaborates a lot more than Dr. Peikoff did in his treatment, which is a brief, and Ayn Rand's treatment you've now all read and is pretty brief. I think Jonathan mentioned on the chat, Harry Binswanger's having talked about it in his lectures on philosophy and economics. So that's another resource. But written sources are often easier to grapple with than lectures. And I think Ankar's perspective on it and Harry's are a little bit different. So it might be, for people who really want to delve into this, look at both of those and see where they're agreeing and disagreeing in interpretation and see what you guys think.
In the Facebook group, Daniel had a question that I think for the most part has been addressed by your explanation. But he said that he was struggling with the notion that one object of reality can have two distinct objective values at the same time. And he's asking too if that distinction is important or connected to other parts of Ayn Rand's philosophy.
So the issue is, can there be two objective values at the same time? And there are way more than two, right? Because for each person who's being objective in his evaluating of something, it will have the object will have an objective value to that person. So I'm married, and I love my wife, and she's very important to me. And her objective value to me is higher than her objective value to someone else who might value her as a friend or as their physician or an employee or whatever. Both of us are being objective in evaluating her, but I evaluate her higher than they do. She's more important, more of a priority to me than she is to the other person, even though we're both being objective. So an objective value includes a to whom component. And where there are different whoms, so to speak, there will be different objective values, right? But now the socially objective value is where the whom is the society understood as all the people interacting on a market. So it's the only way in which a society as a whole or a group as a whole on that scale can objectively value something. But the fact that there's more than one objective value is just covered by the different to whoms, and this is the to whom of the social scale, right? And then the philosophically objective value is we're imagining all the different to whoms, and we're imagining the whom who would have the most knowledge and ability to make use of this value and to extract all the potential within it. So that's how I understand that point. Ankar, is that in line with how you're thinking about it, or do you have anything to add or subtract?
No, I think that's how I think about it too. I was thinking of the other aspect of the question of, are there other areas to apply the distinction? And I don't think about it like that. I think of it rather, there's a distinction between philosophically objective and socially objective, and it's being applied to the market, not it's a distinction that is that you arrive at just by thinking about the market, and then you ask them, well, does it apply to other phenomena or something like that? It's the other way around, I think.
Well, are there other things than market price that we can say are socially objective?
Well, I think it's the similar. So you brought up some other things about how prices could be determined, and you said, well, I mean, one you gave as it could be a commissar. That's invalid, I think, for all kinds of decisions. But you gave voting. Mm-hmm. And it's not as though voting, I think voting in terms of, well, what should be the rent of an apartment, or what we wrote, that's non-objective and so on. But voting for political candidates, and that's a proper method of doing it. And I think you can have the same kind of distinction between who, if you're looking at from a philosophical perspective of the best possible demand, so who's the best candidate? Mm-hmm. But then you could think from the perspective of the voters, and so it's what matters is what the socially. They have to think about it and evaluate it, and nobody can come in and then say, well, no, obviously this was the better candidate, and I can show that from a philosophical perspective. Therefore, this person should be whatever, president or congressman for this district, and so. And it's again, you're thinking of looking at the process and what goes into it, and there's a perspective of it. It's the decisions of the individuals involved, and that's in terms of the social objectivity of it. But you can have another perspective on it, which is the more philosophical perspective. And you do. I mean, people think that what's important is people think like this. Like they didn't select the best candidate, and there's a point to that. It's not just, well, no, the best candidate is whoever they selected. That's not right. And so I don't think of this as just, it's a market phenomenon. It's in terms of, and she talks about it as like the broad field of objectivity. And I think in terms of social interaction, there's the issue of objectivity enters in all kinds of ways. I mean, the running of government is another where it is.
Yeah, so the voting one is really interesting because it would be the intrinsicist view, in effect, to say, well, this is the guy who was the best, and he's not the one who won the election. So it's bad that the guy who won the election is being sworn into office, right? As you're expecting the philosophically objective choice, even if you're right about who that is, to kind of write its way into people's values, and therefore for him to succeed. So we can see what intrinsicism, as opposed to socially objective in a political decision process like proper voting would be. What would be the subjectivist side of that? Well, I think it would be something like, so if you look back to the Bush-Gore election, right, there was a group of people who thought whoever cast the most votes, whoever the most people wanted, regardless of the process, that's what we should be trying to figure out, who the most people intended to vote for. And then that person should be president, regardless of the Electoral College. And even if we accept the Electoral College system, regardless of whether they succeeded in, there was an issue in that election of whether people punched the cards properly or not. And some votes didn't get counted because people only dimpled their chads rather than punching all the way through them, right? As opposed to people saying, look, no, we need a process worked out by which it's not just the will of the people, but some way in which people register what they want in a way where power is divided among the states. And then there's, within each district, there's a procedure agreed upon in advance so that we can really tell and certify for sure who voted for whom. And then they could be tallied up in a certain way. And what's important isn't who slightly more people want between Bush or Gore in the country, but that a procedure that takes into account in the right way, in a way that is reliable and known in advance and that we can all plan for and work around, that the person who wins a contest, a voting contest conducted that way, becomes the president. And so again, there we have the objective versus the subjectivist argument would be, no, more people want Hillary Clinton than Trump, or wanted Gore than Bush. And the intrinsicist objection would be, I don't think the intrinsicist would think Gore or Clinton was the best person, but whoever they think, John Galt or something, is the best person, and therefore he should be president, and to hell with voting. Whereas, again, we have the objective in voting. And I think there are other places where you might say they're socially objective, as opposed, the phenomenon of social objectivity comes in if you're trying to think about, for example, what artwork was most influential or something like that. It's not which one was best, and it's not necessarily which one people like the most, but which one, because of the choices that they made, had certain effects. And there are probably other contexts where we could apply it. We've got a few other questions that came up in the webinar chat.
Yes, Mark has a question which he formulated in two ways. I'm going to read the second way in which he formulated it. He says, if the objective choices of each person are systematically skewed towards bad results because of inbuilt/biological cognitive biases, can't we build regulations that correct for these biases and make the market more rational?
Well, if we have these biases inbuilt, why are we, whoever is building this thing, somehow less biased and more able to correct for it than everybody else at large? I mean, how did we get to be in charge of everybody such that we, whoever the we is that can do this, other than by some process of having been voted in by the very same people who allegedly have these biases that they can't surmount, but somehow we can? The fact is that we all are able to be rational. We all have whatever challenges to overcome in being rational we have, and I think those are exaggerated by people who talk about biases, or at least they're misinterpreted often by people who talk about biases. But we all have them. We all have whatever challenges we have to overcome. And there's no privileged group of us who's in a position to correct for the mistakes or irrationality of everyone else.
And on the more specific aspect, he brings up the nudge and this kind of argument, there's a vast difference, and this is part of what I think Ayn Rand is arguing in this essay, that you can't force the good on someone. There's a vast difference between arguing with someone that this is how you should structure your environment and so on. But it will make it more likely and easier for you to make a rational decision, and not get or succumb or get sucked into an irrational perspective. To argue with someone for that, and this is how you should structure your environment, versus coming in and structuring someone's environment and in effect telling them it doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter if you think you have this problem, that you need help with it. All of that is irrelevant. We're going to dictate for you. And that is overriding the whole process of evaluation, of judgment, that is what's being argued, what Rand is arguing, is a necessary condition for actually valuing something, that you understand its relationship to your life, how it's advancing your interest, and you're pursuing it because of that. So I'll give you an example of the kind of thing, nudge. It's a real phenomenon, but there's a difference between choosing it and it being forced on you. So I've noticed about myself that when I'm trying to kick habits, it's much easier for me to do something cold turkey than gradually reduce and so on. So if I'm on a diet, if I think I need to change my diet or lose weight, I can't do, okay, well, only eat one cookie. That's it. And have cookies in the house. And so I'm not only going to eat one, but if I just get rid of them all, there's none in the pantry and so on. I don't crave them. I don't run to the store to go buy them. And that I'm structuring my environment in a certain way, knowing the kinds of choices I'm going to make and why, and that this, what I'm trying to do and so on. And that there's a rationality to that. And it's a real value pursuit, I think, in that. But if someone forces that on me and I think, no, this is not what I need, this is not what I want, this is not how I can actually pursue my health and so on, it's a completely different context. And that is what is blurred in these, I mean, because you get supposedly free market people of, well, why don't we nudge them and so on. And it's your bypass, this is her point, that it's like offering a picture gallery at the price of cutting out the person's eyes. So you're pretending to offer values and you're destroying his whole ability to actually engage in evaluation and to think about it and to choose what is right because he sees that it advances his interest. And it's a contradiction to do that.
Mark has a follow-up question. He asks, is, quote, rational market a legitimate concept? It seems like any qualifier of, quote, market gets one away from the pure concept of market. Who would judge the market to be rational and by what standard?
I mean, I've never used the qualifier rational market, and I'm trying to think if I've seen other people use the
well, are markets rational? People ask that kind of question sometimes. And there's, are there such things as market failures, or is this or that thing a market failure? Did the market get this wrong? You get that kind of language.
Yeah, and I think those conceptualizations are wrong. That and it relates to the later part of the essay, I think, that the market is not a means that someone implemented to achieve a goal. In that case, it's the result, a market results from people being free and their rights protected. Then what happens is a free market in which individuals have goals that they're pursuing, but the market doesn't have a goal. It doesn't have some kind of criteria of it succeeded in achieving the goal or it failed to achieve a goal. I think that perspective is a collectivistic perspective.
And it's as philosophers or theorists or political economists looking at the organization of a society, we can say that in a situation of freedom where the phenomenon of a market develops, there's a kind of, if you want to call it rationality or objectivity in the evaluation that arises out of a market, based on freedom and the fact that it's the only way to respect the individual's judgment and let individuals value for themselves and have a aggregate valuation coming out of the individuals individually valuing. And so in that sense, you could say that the market's price is rational, is objective, and so forth. And it is objective in this sense of socially objective. In another sense, you could say the market price is irrational at a certain time, if what you mean is, I think there's widespread irrationality right now about tulips, and that's why tulip bulbs have gotten so incredibly expensive. It's because there's some fad going on and so forth. It's still the socially objective price, but it's philosophically way off from objective, and the price of meth is, way off from what the objective price of meth would be philosophically objective. Presumably, I've not, don't have that any experience with it, but from its reputation. So in that sense, you can talk about the market price being rational or irrational. You can talk about the market as a process being objective in its output in the way we've discussed, but it's not something that's implemented as a method to achieve that aim. It's just the sum of everybody proceeding in the way they should proceed, and or some of them and some of them not, and everyone proceeding in the way they should to just the extent that they leave other people free to make their own determinations. And then that's where you have force extracted, and then the market is free. And the valuation can arise out of that. Euler says that he guesses that if a market is made up of more rational people, the socially objective value will be closer to the philosophically objective value. And I think that's right, but not just more rational people, also more intelligent people, more knowledgeable people. But yeah, the better informed, more rational people are, the closer those two prices will come to one another. I think that's true. Okay, let's move on to a couple of the other topics we had in mind for today. So Rand talks about the criticisms of capitalism and how they come from the intrinsic or subjective view of value, and Ankar summed up some of that for us earlier. There's a more general point she's making, though, about the criticisms of capitalism and altruism and the tribal premise. She describes them, or at least the tribal premise she describes, as being anti the mind. And part of this idea of objectivity and capitalism being based on an objective view of values is that capitalism is based on the recognition of the mind's role in values. That the mind has a role, contra intrinsicism, where the values are just out there and the mind has nothing to do with it, but that it's the mind thinking, reasoning based on evidence that has this role, contra subjectivism, which would hold that someone's consciousness plays a role in something's being of value, but it's a person's whims, their desires, not their reasoning, and not their knowledge in particular. Right? So that valuing is a kind of knowing. It's a fact-based activity, an engagement with the world. That's what the objective view of values brings in. That is what is respected by capitalism, that capitalism is the system based on that. And that's not its definition, that's a feature of it that comes out of its being the system that respects rights. But rights are our recognition as a rational, recognition of the requirements of our rational nature in a social context. And then another perspective on that is that they recognize the objectivity of values. And then capitalism is the social economic system that recognizes the objectivity of values. So there's some connection between this valuing of and recognizing the role of the mind and the definition she gives of capitalism and the talk of capitalism is based on objective value. But there's maybe more to this point about the objections to capitalism as being, in some sense, anti-mind or attacks on the mind or attacks on the rational. So does anyone here in the group have any thoughts or questions on that aspect of the essay? And Ankar, do you have anything you want to say on it?
Yeah, I'll say one thing about the tribal premise, because I think the end of the article, there's, pretty lengthy quotation from the Encyclopedia Britannica article. And I think it's part of what she's trying to emphasize is the degree or the extent to which there's a obliviousness, but I think she thinks evasion, of the role that intelligence, ability, the mind plays in production, and that what happens under capitalism, if you think back to the first part, where she's emphasizing the right to disagree, that this protects the most valuable attribute. How does she put it? The most valuable attribute. Well, I don't find it the quote quickly. But the creative mind, and it's the mind that, or think of it in the Fountainhead terms, the creator, the innovator, the person who will go down new paths, discovers new knowledge. That the fact that capitalism unleashes that person, that he's free to function, free to teach people, free for people to see that what he's doing and to learn from him, that you can understand the explosion in the standard of living and the rise in mankind's ability to produce without that perspective. And I think this is the tribal perspective, the tribal premise. She thinks it deeper than altruism wipes out that whole perspective. So you can think of it as, if you think of altruism in the Marx kind of formulation, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, there's still a recognition there of ability, and that ability is what leads to production. It's what leads to the creation of values. It's just the person who has the ability shouldn't be getting the values. He should be giving them up to the person who needs them. But the tribal premise, she says, it goes further, that it denies the whole role of individual ability, individual intelligence, individual thought, knowledge that goes into production. And that's what she emphasizes in the discussion of capitalism that you find in the encyclopedia, that how incredibly collectivistic it is, that there's no awareness of that there's individual actors with minds who are doing stuff, who are taking productive actions and engaged in real thought, science, technology. And one of the things that she quotes and then comments on, just this sentence from the encyclopedia: in underdeveloped economies, the difficult task of statesmanship is to get underway a cumulative process of economic development. For once a certain momentum is attained, further advances appear to follow more or less automatically. Close quote. And that, from Atlas Shrugged, that's the kind of, the goods are here. How did they get here? Who knows? And they will just automatically continue. And it's such an obliteration of the true nature of production and of the role of the mind in production.
And it's striking that you see this in people who are real defenders of capitalism. So one example that always stands out to me about this, and I've talked about this before, I think, in the Atlas Project, and I know Yaron Brook has talked about it, is the essay I Pencil by Reed, which is in some ways a really good essay. So it's written from the perspective of a pencil, which I think is part of the problem with it, actually. And it's talking about the fact that allegedly there's no one who knows how to build a pencil. the pencil got made, and its being made was the collaboration of God knows how many people, from the people who grew the rubber and the eraser, to who grew the trees, to who harvested them, the shippers, and the people who made the food for the people who made the rubber, and so forth. So all of these people are involved. The people don't know each other. They might not like each other, and so forth. And so nobody knows how to make a pencil, and it's left to the pencil is the only one who's got enough cognizance of the situation to tell this story. And that is absurd. I mean, someone owns a pencil company. Someone decided to build pencils and to get the financing to get all these other people together to build pencils. And okay, he didn't plant the tree sprout that did it, but he recognized that there had to be trees to do it. And he has to get in touch with the other people who know all the other things to make them. And if he's going to keep on succeeding at building pencils or, producing pencils as various things shift, he's going to need to learn more and more about his supply lines and what things go into the supply lines so that he can take cognizance of possible changing conditions. I mean, think of Tim Cook, who's the CEO of Apple and got made the CEO of Apple, right? Became so high up in Apple because he's a genius at supply chain management, right? That was his role in the company. He doesn't know how to make an iPhone? Sure he does. I mean, he can't himself by hand, do it from scratch, but that's to grossly misunderstand what it is to make something or to create or build something. And what iPencil leaves out is the role of the entrepreneur, the role of the person who figures out how to organize this undertaking and get all the people to do it and make them collaborate. And it's freedom is good, freedom is needed because it enables entrepreneurs to do that. Now, more generally, it's good because it enables everybody to act on their reasoning and use their reason to guide their lives. But what the entrepreneur is doing is a grand scale example of that. And it's because freedom, capitalism, respect for rights enables everyone to do it, and then some people do it on this grand entrepreneurial scale, that it produces wealth. And this whole Hayekian spontaneous order, all this stuff, just, we set people free and they just get rich. Who knows who did it? No one understands how to do it, which is what's behind the iPencil essay, right, is really deeply unjust to what Rand calls the men of the mind. It doesn't tell them sacrifice yourself. It says you don't exist. Somehow this just happens. People organize themselves into companies and corporations and conglomerates and build things, and there are iPhones. That is not what happens. Wealth is the product of producers, and the primary producers in a complex situation, in any situation, are the ones who think about how to do it. But the greater and more complex a division of labor economy, the more you have people who aren't just artisans who think about how to do their art well, but who specialize in the aspect of it of coordinating, and that's what the entrepreneur is. Those are the people who are unleashed under capitalism, who appear under capitalism as a major force in the world for the first time, because there's, for the first time, enough freedom for it to happen. And that is just a perspective that's absent from most thinking about economies and about capitalism, including by pro-market people. And so Hayek, is an example here. Reed, who wrote iPencil, is even Milton Friedman, who did, I think, a better version of presenting the iPencil idea that didn't, as much as the original one, stress this element of it. But these economists are getting something important right about what freedom makes possible. And the idea that you don't need a bureaucrat who can know in advance what the right arrangement is, as you would in a centrally planned economy, and which is impossible, as the Austrian economists argued. But it's not because no one has this knowledge. It's because, or this knowledge is ungettable. It's that there is this kind of knowledge, and it's in the knowledge of the creators. Okay, so that's my piece on that point. Just to connect this to Atlas Shrugged, right? Rand talks there about the various, as she calls it, mystical views, or the protagonist does, one of the protagonists. And she talks about certain of the views, blanking out the existence of the men of the mind, not just mistreating them, but acting as though they don't exist. And actually, she quotes one of the lines from Atlas Shrugged in this essay, What is Capitalism?, earlier on when referencing the Britannica article. The Britannica article. An industrialist, there is no such person. A industrial plant is a natural resource like a mud puddle. And she is really moralistic about, there's a kind of moral indignation on Rand's part whenever she's dealing with these kinds of issues on the ignoring of the achievements of business people, particularly the 19th century robber barons, as they're called, and the failing to credit virtue for their achievements.
And part of then what happens is it looks like rationality is on the side of who she thinks of as mystical and completely irrational. So the way it's misconceptualized in economics, even if they're getting things right, but if you package it like this, that what you've got central planners who are trying to have a rational scheme of how the economy should function. And what you have to realize is no, things are spontaneous, and the creation of a pencil is a miracle, which is the kind of description you get in iPencil. Then people will keep thinking, but we should try to make it rational, and we should try to have more planning and so on. And what you have to get is that there is planning. It's individual planning, which is the only kind of planning that goes on. And the entrepreneurs and the industrials are the people, and this is what Ayn Rand always emphasizes, who have the enormous field of vision of what is possible, of what can be done. So it's in a free market that planning actually happens, the only kind of planning and reasoning that actually takes place, which is in the mind of an individual who's trying to further his life. And she's always adamant when it makes it seem like reason is on the side of the mystics, you completely undercut your ability to win over good people, that is rational people.
Yeah, I think Hayek is the kind of symbol of the alternative way of thinking here. I'm not at all an expert on him, but if you look at titles like The Fatal Conceit, right? So there's this idea that economists and central planners think they're smarter than they are because they imagine they could understand and plan the whole economy, but nobody's that smart that they could understand and plan the whole economy. From Rand's perspective, that's not the problem. It's not that, if somebody was smart enough, but nobody could actually be that smart, they could do it. It's that there's not a fact there to know about how to run a whole economy because the attempt to do it flies in the face of human nature. And the fact about human nature that it flies in the face of is that the human mind doesn't work under coercion. It's reason that is the cause of production. It's reason that is our means of survival. And that for reason to function, it needs to be free. And so that all these millions of people who make up the economy and who do all the work need to be free in order to function. So it's not, again, a conceit or a thinking they know more than they do that is the problem with central planners from Rand's perspective. It's that it's the same problem that somebody would have if they were trying to juice a stone. It's not that they're, not smart enough to get juice out of the stone, or they can't squeeze it hard enough to get orange juice out of the stone. This isn't the kind of thing that by nature could produce juice. You have to find an orange to juice it. And if were controlling a bunch of animals, ruling them by force and controlling them would be the way to do it, but not men. That's not how human beings work. That's not how you can accomplish anything by governing human beings. That's not how they, by their nature, are to be governed. And the results will just be misery and poverty and horror if you try to do it. And that is, in fact, what the results are. Should we, since I've been kind of beating up on a certain perspective that you find in economics, Ankar, since you know the economic literature better than I do you have any thoughts on where we find something more like Rand's perspective? I mean, I have the vague sense that von Mises is closer to her on this than Hazlitt is. I'm not sure of the others.
Than Hayek.
Than Hayek is, rather, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I'm not expert on it, but I do have an undergraduate degree, at least in economics, and I've read some of these things, that there is an emphasis in Mises on the entrepreneur and the role of the entrepreneur, and the kind of the acts of the mind in evaluation. It's called economic calculation, but don't think of that as just like adding up. He's not an accountant. That's not the kind of calculation that's going on. There's an emphasis that this, and an individual mind has to perform these things. This is what happens under capitalism, and it's what is absent because outlawed under the various forms of collectivism, communism, socialism, fascism. And Mises was a severe critic of all those kinds of systems. And I think that aspect of the Mises and the Austrian view is most emphasized of the people still alive. He's now very old, is Kerzner, who has written a lot on the role of the entrepreneur in economics and emphasizing that. And that, I think, is more in line with the way that Rand thinks of how the economy works. And as she puts it in this essay, that it's ruled by the producers, and it's particularly, it's the innovative. And that's when one thinks of entrepreneur, it's not just he's running this family business now, taking third generation or whatever. It's the person who ventures into the new and discovers new things and new ways of proceeding, of creating, of organization, of supply chain management. You gave of Tim Cook and so on. That's the person who's in control, in effect, of the economy. Not a dictator, but because he's so productive, he's what everyone is pegging their own understanding of how to produce and so on, and watching and so on. And so I would put Mises and Kerzner as emphasizing this aspect, and Hayek is diminishing it.
Last week, I mentioned a piece by Rob Tarr that's in the forthcoming book, Foundations of a Free Society, Reflections on Ayn Rand's Political Philosophy. And Rob talks a lot about the objective view of value being implicit in the Austrian tradition. And he emphasizes Menger, von Mises, and Kirchner. I think he doesn't think it's totally absent from Hayek either, but yes. I think in Hayek, at least you get this rhetoric that pulls in the opposite direction. I don't know how much it colors his actual economics. Should we move on to the point then about that Rand closes with in the essay? And then I'd like to leave time for sort of general questions. And we have a few lined up. This idea that a philosophical revolution is really needed to defend capitalism, that we can't defend it in conventional ways. And I think we can see why. The attempt to defend it in a conventional way, without rethinking the nature of value, without abandoning this tribal premise, well, it fails to recognize the distinctive nature of capitalism and what's good about it from Rand's perspective. And capitalism has not been properly appreciated because people are thinking of it from within a tribal view. I think that's the essence of the criticism. And from within the kinds of view of value that go with that, a kind of intrinsic or subjective view. But I think we had some questions that came up that were to this point in different ways about how different aspects of Rand's radicalism relate to her view of what's required to defend capitalism. So, Augustina, am I right that there were some issues about either egoism here or some of the more ethical features of Rand's thought?
Nothing too explicit came up, but people were using language that referred to morality. So I would say if you could explain a little bit more the connection between ethics and politics and how politics stem from ethics.
Ankar, do you want to start in on that, or should I?
Yeah, I can start a little bit. I'll do it from the perspective of rights. So to go back to that, capitalism is the system that recognizes individual rights or the rights of the individual, and including property rights, but it's not only property rights. So it's the whole range of life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you think of this from the perspective of the objective theory of values, all these aspects, that it's the right to, we talked a little bit in a previous section, that the right to life that she thinks of as that's the fundamental right. And it's liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the crucial means towards the goal of advancing your own interest, your own self-interest, your own well-being, your life or your happiness, that you can set that as your goal. And then if what the pursuit of values requires is thinking, knowledge, and then the action to bring these values into existence. And that's what so just as there's a pursuit of happiness, the pursuit requires thought and production. Those are the two central activities. And the right to liberty protects thought, you can think of as, or its emphasis is on the role of thought in the life of a rational being if he's pursuing the proper goal of his own interest or happiness. And the right to property protects the crucial role of production in that. And both of these are directed by his judgment, thought, and mind. So these are separable, but not separate aspects of life. Production requires thought. And in order to be able to think, you need to be secure in your person, you have to be able to carve out aspect of reality where you're sovereign. You can't, to take just a simple kind of example, but this was what happens in totalitarian system. If someone can come in and take all your property away and throw you in jail and subject you to torture and constant bombardment with loud noise, and so, which happens in too many of these authoritarian systems, you can totally destroy a person's ability to think. So it's the emphasis on this is the activity that's required of a human life. So this is what has to be protected. And then this is what you see working out in a capitalist system. And the point of view of the objectivity of values, part of it is this is what it looks like when a mind is free to engage in thought and production. This is how to understand what's going on.
Yeah, I'd add to that just underscoring that the moral praising, giving moral credit to the essential activity of production, and then the particular people who did it, seeing these on the grand scale, seeing these people as morally good, as doing what's right, not as just okay and what they did has good consequences, but that this is a grand scale embodiment of the way human beings ought to live, of what's good for human beings. That's something that's really distinctive to Rand, and unless you see the people who are the kind of paragon achievers under capitalism in that way, you're not going to value or appreciate capitalism. You're going to see them as exploiters. You're going to see there is something wrong with the system. You're going to be worried about, it's becoming more and more unequal is the current version of it because, these people, Rockefeller or Gates or whomever, Zuckerberg, are getting so rich. And you'll resent their control over the things they created, as we see people now resenting Facebook and Google for their control over their own platforms. There's a kind of moral perspective I think you need to have, or that Rand brings to capitalism and to the entrepreneurs, that I think is essential to seeing what's right and good about this system. Certainly she thinks that. And I agree with her on that. Mark's asking how what we're saying relates to the distinction between deontology and consequentialism versus objective morality as presumably being a third thing. I think that distinction comes up primarily, at least the place where it comes up most in my thinking is in how you understand. So this is a different view of how to understand moral principles. If something's moral, is it just moral to act a certain way because there's some principle that says for really no reason, but just it's kind of intrinsic in it that this mode of action is the right one? That's one view. That's deontology. There are certain ways you just ought to act, and there's no reason why, but you just must. Or on the other hand, are they justified on their consequences? So there's some kind of consequence, some kind of state of affairs that you're just meant to pursue, like, say, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, a la Mill. And then any action is right which does that. So the deontological view is the one associated with Kant, and he's the kind of chief defender of it in the history of thought. And then there's this consequentialist view associated with Mill, among others. And if you have that distinction and think there's no third type of view between those, it's going to be very hard to make sense of rights. You're either going to think that rights are something that comes from nowhere, there's no real justification of them, and it's a coincidence if following them leads to success in practice. Or on the other hand, you're going to think of rights as just rules of thumb that are meant to be followed when they lead to success in practice, but they won't necessarily always, and there's no way to tell whether they always will. And so you're not going to be absolutist about them. Whereas if you're a deontologist, you are going to be absolutist about them, but you're also not going to be able to trace them back to any role they play in any causal system. So you're not going to really be able to know the context for them. And I think ultimately you're not going to be able to tell how they apply in new and difficult situations. So this is a kind of deep ethical issue of what's the nature of moral principles. Are they deontological or consequentialist? I think they're neither, and I think Rand shows a way for them to be neither by showing how ethics rests in the requirement of human life. There is a type of life, which is a human life, the only type that human beings can succeed at leading. We can tell in broad abstract terms what manner human beings need to lead to live in order to live. We could identify in broad abstract terms the kind of principles we need to obey. Principles like faking reality doesn't work, so you should be honest. Principles like things that your values aren't going to come into reality on your own, so you need to bring them into reality. Principles like reason is your means of knowing things, so you have to apply it, and it's your only guide to life and action. And these are the kind of basic principles of Rand's ethics, and they are not either deontological or consequentialist, but have a third status. And we could have a whole seminar on the status of moral principles. But I think there's a false alternative between deontological and consequential. And if you have it, you won't be able to understand, you won't be able to get rights right. Ankar, can you see Mark's question? Euler says what the deontological versus consequentialist seems like intrinsicist versus subjectivist. I think that's right, although they're really intrinsicist and subjectivist versions of each of them. But they're missing the same thing, namely, they're missing the role of a mind grasping, forming values in accordance with facts in an abstract manner as central to self-direction. I
think Euler might mean what Ankar mentioned that session about false alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are both false alternatives, I think. Ankar, can you see Mark's question in the Q&A?
Yeah. So Mark asks, I assume you want to take it up. I think it's a good question.
I was suggesting you do, but...
So it's this one, because politics and economics are based on ethics. How do you effectively frame more narrow political or economic discussions without giving up and saying, in effect, we can't really have this discussion without establishing man as a rational being, etc.? So without going into the whole questions and theories about morality. So you can't, and this is a more general question that one can have about philosophical issues. You can't talk about politics and economics because they rest on ethics. So don't you have to be talking about ethics? But if you take Ayn Rand's view, well, ethics rests on epistemology and metaphysics. So can you really have any discussion about ethics? Don't you have to go to the epistemology, and don't you have to go to the metaphysics? And there's a perspective, I think, which is true, that it's to have a consistent, worked out, integrated view on all these issues, you have to go back to fundamentals. And Ayn Rand thinks of philosophy as the science of fundamentals. And this is a part of real philosophical thinking. You have to do this. But on the other hand, discussions of politics and economics, you have to think of what the context is. But if you're having this context, if the discussion is with Americans about political and economic issues, think of just what Ayn Rand is doing in What is Capitalism. So she's saying that there's this tribal premise that infects and distorts all kinds of issues and attempts to understand the way that politics and economics work and how you should properly think about it. It's a collectivist premise at the root. Now, I think many Americans are individualists at heart and in their soul, in effect, even if they couldn't give voice to it exactly. And they often say or echo the slogans of collectivism. So you can have a really productive conversation with it without having to go to everything in ethics and so on, to emphasize, no, what you need to do is look at these issues from the perspective of the individual. And what America's about is supposed to be about the individual able to pursue his life. It's why immigrants come here. They want to build a better life for themselves and for their loved ones. They're here to pursue their happiness. You have to look at the perspective of the individual. And instead, take something very simple like minimum wage. Instead of thinking of it about in terms of groups and what is the economic effect on GDP if we have minimum wage or not, or subsidies or tariff. It's what does it do to an actual individual? So you've got a person who is not in a very great family. He's in a district where the schools are terrible. He's not very well educated, but he wants to build a life for himself and he wants to rise. But if someone's going to employ him, he's not that productive yet. And if someone has to pay him $12 an hour when really all he can produce right now is things worth $5 an hour, and you're saying, no, you can't do that. He can't be hired for $5 an hour. So you're preventing the employer and employee of engaging in a beneficial transaction. What does it do to that individual? What happens to him? And then if he turns to the streets or he turns to crime, well, what goes into that decision if you're closing off all the other alternatives to him? And why do you want to do this to an individual? And this is emphasizing the individual. And you don't have to go into a whole discussion about what are the foundations of morality and deontology and consequentialism and so on. If there's really no shared values, then it is hard to have a discussion. But I don't think that's typically the case when you're dealing with better people, when you're discussing politics and economics.
Yeah, one way to think about it is that knowing philosophy and knowing the philosophical roots of capitalism and of freedom helps you know how to defend it and what issues to bring up to defend it when arguing with people. That doesn't mean you bring up all the deepest points about metaphysics or whatever, but it means that you look to the issues that affect an individual, that deal with an individual. If say, policy regarding social media companies is being discussed, you think about the idea, well, someone made these companies and runs them, and there's virtue there, and that's the kind of thing that gets ignored in these kind of political discussions. So you go to that issue and you bring it up when people aren't. You're sensitive to when people are discussing things on the tribal premise, as Rand calls it, and then you come back at it from a different individualistic premise. You don't always need to say that that's what you're doing. Then in some context, you go deeper and you say, here's how I'm coming at this, and here's how it's different. And you still don't need to bring up something like deontology versus consequentialism. That'll come up if someone asks you a question like, I've studied deontology and consequentialism, and I think those are the only two ways to base moral principles, and it seems like you're not basing yours on either of them, or sometimes you're doing one and sometimes you're doing the other. Well, then they're raising a kind of deep meta-ethical question, and then you need to go into kind of foundations of ethics to discuss that. But most of the time, those questions aren't raised by the other people when you're just talking about politics. And you can take an ethical perspective on politics and an epistemological perspective on ethics. And that's, I mean, what I try to do when I'm talking to a general audience on political issues. And I think it's what authors at ARI do. I think the New Ideal blog has done a lot of really good pieces that address different current events type issues from this this kind of philosophically informed perspective. Augustina is texting. We have this question from earlier about the foundations of property rights. Do we want to go to that audio question?
Yes, it was a question from Shruti. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Shruti, I'm going to unmute you now, so you'll be able to talk. Oh, it seems that I cannot unmute Shruti because...
there's a button allow to talk, right?
Yes, but it's giving me a message that Shruti has an older version of Zoom. That's why I cannot unmute.
Oh, well, I was looking forward to hearing from...
I have his question right here, though. He has, two questions.
I don't know what if that's a male or female name. Yes, go ahead and call in if you have a way to call in, Sherry, and we could deal with another question while you're doing that. Just see if we can make this work. But someone can call in by phone.
Okay. Meanwhile...
Yeah, meanwhile, give us one of the Facebook questions.
Yes. Alexandra had a question. She said, Rand defines capitalism as a social system which is based on respect for individual rights, including property rights. This seems to contradict Milton Friedman's classification of capitalism as an economic system which can exist, albeit unsuccessfully, within countries ruled by statist regimes. What are your thoughts on this?
I'm not positive that's fair to Friedman. Did he think the capitalism could fully exist within these countries ruled by statist regimes? I'm not sure. I mean, he did, or he or some of his people dealt with Pinochet and so forth, but I'm not sure what his perspective on that was. Did he think we could have full capitalism within the context of a despotic regime, or did he just think we can get closer to it and it's better than nothing? I don't know. Ankar, do you know?
I mean, from my reading of it, I would say no, he doesn't think you can have full capitalism without, but he changes his views on some things as well. And I'm not a scholar of Friedman, so I haven't read everything. But I think the perspective of thinking of it more as an economic system instead of a social system, I think that you can look at it that, that's how he and many other of the so-called free market people think of it in terms of the economic principles involved and not the wider social, so political and moral principles. And I think it's important from Rand's perspective to think of this as a total. We'll talk more about this in the last session, I think, when we're talking about the aspects of freedom. She'll talk about economic freedom, political freedom, and intellectual freedom, but she thinks of these as going together, that there's freedom and these are aspects of it. And if you're talking about full freedom, you're talking about freedom in all these areas, which is what a full protection of individual rights looks like. Um, um, I don't know if here we want to talk a bit about the mixed economy.
Yeah, that is a good. This is something that Amish had raised on Facebook and has been kind of flirting around the periphery of what we've been talking about. But yeah, so it's not that you have capitalism or you have full-fledged statism in Rand's view, nor is it in her view that there's some third option that's got its own sort of fully coherent internal logic and is a third system between capitalism and statism, with fascism and communism and so forth being varieties of statism, we should mention. Rather, there are mixtures of capitalism and statism. So situations where, capitalism and socialism, let's say, situations where you have part of the country, or in certain aspects to a certain extent, the country functioning on capitalist principles, but compromised, watered down by elements of statist controls. Or on the other hand, you could have a country that's predominantly statist, but that's made allowances for elements of capitalism, right? And Rand talks about different politicians as favoring a mixed economy. She thinks what we have is a mixed economy, and most countries today are mixed economies, the exceptions being the total dictatorships, right? And most countries in her time were mixed economies. More, I think, are now than were then. The exceptions being the total dictatorships. There are no total capitalist countries. And she would talk about different politicians being in favor of a mixed economy, but on one or the other side of the mixture. So she talked about Goldwater when she was endorsing him as somebody who was in favor of a mixed economy, but in the sense of thinking some vaguely defined elements of statism or controls were compatible with freedom, as opposed to his opponents who thought that some vaguely defined elements of freedom were compatible with a predominantly controlled economy. And so that's how she thought about it. What's the principle you're on? And then there are compromised cases of it. And then some compromises are more directly in the middle and some veering one way or the other. And she had a lot to say about what happens in a mixed economy. And Ankar, I know you had some things you wanted to talk about this.
Two points that of what happens under a mixed economy. If we're thinking of it as when we talked about men's rights and that essay, this is a principle, and it's the fundamental principle of a proper political philosophy and a proper approach to politics. When that principle is being compromised or being compromised on, what you have is a growing, you can think of it as unprincipled, but if you're thinking of it particularly from the point of view of government and law, it's lawlessness. I mean, the whole point of law is to put the use of force under objective control, but that means under the law, but her whole view of law is that it's a system of principles. So it's to put it under principled control, with the idea of individual rights being the fundamental principle that's guiding all of law. And it's to protect each individual's rights that sets the purpose of law. And when that is being, when you're losing that as an understanding of what government is, you're compromising on that principle, or you're saying there's also other things that are relevant, the so-called public interest or the common good. It's increasingly that what's happening is the government, and so the economic political system is functioning without the guidance of any principles. It becomes more and more non-objective. It becomes more and more lawless. And she often describes it as what you have now is a real element of anarchy. And that what's really bad about the mixed economy is that is what is happening. And that now everybody's pitted against each other. And it's a struggle. The kind of portrait of capitalism as dog eat dog, she thinks, as we've been talking about, completely wrong. But what happens too much in a mixed economy is that people rightly feel like it's this person is trying to tax me in order to get his schemes going, and so I've got to now go on the offense and try to attack him. You see that, I mean, with antitrust laws, it's Microsoft, the antitrust laws are used against them, and then they start using the antitrust laws against other companies, and they're both now trying to destroy each other rather than compete for customers. They're trying to actively destroy each other. And this is what happens more and more in a mixed economy. And I think it's important that she's linking it to its semi-anarchy. And full anarchy is not pretty.
Yeah, it's a really important concretization of the point from the nature of government. And we'll see more examples of this in the pieces we're going to read for next week. But for Rand, the continuum is, objective governance on the one side to anarchy, group warfare on the other side. And any kind of tyranny is just an example of the same principle as the anarchy or group warfare, because it's just different people jockeying to control the apparatus of power. And, Stalin's got it now, but someone will come and take it over later. And whatever group has it is just exerting their will capriciously on other people. And then everybody's fighting to either be that person or to have the influence over that person or group of people. And the term she'll often use is pressure group warfare for how it plays out in a mixed economy. And there's a kind of logic to pressure group warfare where each group, when they get the reins of power, now has an incentive to do a little bit more with it. And so the government grows and becomes more statist, or rather the intrusions of the government into the economy grows. And Mark Online is saying this is like public choice theory. And I think there's something to that. They're good at studying, or you can see public choice theory as studying the kinds of pressure group dynamics within a mixed economy. Okay, we have Shruti's question. It turns out she or he wasn't able to get online to speak to us. So Augustine is going to read the question out, I think. Is that where we landed?
Yes. So the question is, what is the genesis of private property? How does one begin claiming ownership of land and resources for the purposes of trade?
Okay, so this is, I think, a good transition to really what we're going to be talking about next time, which is really all about property. But let's just make a few preliminary points now, and that might be a good way to close for today. Recall that the right to property is the right to produce and to have the fruits of your productive activity, right? So to use and dispose of the values you've produced. So the central concept for Rand in property, I think, is the concept of production. And you can see some of this, this is what she's thinking here is in a way continuous with the Lockean tradition in thinking about property rights, particularly rights to land. But there's a different take on it in Rand, and is, I think, discontinuous with the analyses of property that put the main focus on scarcity. And you see this coming out of Hume. I don't want to say scarcity or plays no role at all in thinking about property, but it's not the central idea from which property arises. So the issue is somebody produces a value, and human beings live by producing values to consume, right? And so an individual needs to be free to consume the values that he has produced. And then the property are the values that he has produced. And then we need to understand what that means, how that principle applies to property in different domains. So Shruti's asking now on the chat, how does one establish a laissez-faire capitalist economy on new land untouched by civilization? Well, let's come to that in a moment. But just in the case of land, I think it's when somebody starts putting unowned land to a productive use, they then acquire property in that land for the first time. And what you need is That's like the broad principle. And then the government, which is defining and administering and applying the principle of rights in this domain, has to come up with specific procedures by which you make it known that you've started putting, and by which you can prove it to everybody else via, some kind of procedure, that you have put a piece of land now to productive purpose, and in that sense incorporated it into your life and made it a value, whereas before it was just some land out there. And then that then creates a procedure for owning land. And Rand cites approvingly the Homestead Act, which the United States used to privatize, much of the wilderness in the western part of the country. So that would be the example with land. We'll talk next time about how she thinks this principle applies to other domains of property, particularly to intellectual property and to the airwaves, which she sees as a type of property. Now, Shruti is asking, how does one establish laissez-faire capitalist economy on new land untouched by civilization? Well, I think that's the way. The first people to put the land to some use, then own it. And then we just need to define the details of that. And that'll be set, will need to be done in light of the technology of the time and what ways there are to put land of use and to establish that one's done that. Ankar, do you have anything you want to add to this?
No, just that it is a really good transition, because this is exactly the kind of issues that we'll be talking about next Tuesday in talking about property. And even when we're thinking about intellectual property status of airwaves, as Greg was saying, she links it to thinking about things like land. And so we will be thinking, though specifically focused on some of the newer forms of property or some of the intellectual property. We will talk broadly as well about just the idea of property and property rights. So definitely tune in next Tuesday.
And thank you all for tuning in tonight.